Jai Hind, Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 5th of November 2020. Now, for your convenience, I have added timestamps in the description. So, if you want to skip to a particular news, please use those timestamps. And PDFs for selected topics are also available on the Telegram channel, the link to which is available in the description. Also, if you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. Also, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. So without wasting your time, let's get started. So starting with the Hindu, Biden ahead but no clear winner yet. So this is going to be a very exciting one. And of course, it will be going to the Supreme Court. Both Trump and Biden have said that if they lose, they will be going to the Supreme Court. So this is for sure that one of them is going to the Supreme Court. Nobody is going to concede. As a matter of fact, Trump already has celebrated that he has won. So let us see what happens in the coming days. Then again, just the headline, Arnab Goswami held in 2018 suicide case. So new drama unfolding in Maharashtra. Then this one is important. It is in public interest to set up courts to try lawmakers. So basically, Supreme Court is trying to set up 12 courts, special courts to try the outstanding cases against the present and former MPs and MLAs, right? So the Supreme Court is saying that it is in the public interest to do so because there are around 4,000 to 5,000 cases that are pending, and that basically erodes public's confidence in the judicial system, right? So that is why Supreme Court is going for that. So the court has only public interest and faith in judiciary in mind while pushing for setting up of special courts to expeditiously try sitting and former MPs and MLAs accused of various crimes. The bench was considering a report filed by committee of the Madras High Court that raised reservations over the setting up of special courts to exclusively try legislators for various offences. The committee said that the special courts cannot be offender-centric. That means they have to be generic, right? Then again, very important one, Supreme Court lays down guidelines for matrimonial cases. So let us see what this is about. So basically, matrimonial cases for alimony are filed under Section 125 of CRPC. So now Supreme Court has come out with standard guidelines that have to be followed by family courts, magistrates and lower courts while hearing applications filed by women seeking maintenance. First, the court made some observation that women deserted by husbands were left in dire straits, often reduced to destitution for lack of means to sustain themselves and their children. This is very true, right? And Section 125 has been very, very important. It was under this section only that Shah Bano had filed the case for maintenance, and that led to whole triple talaq judgment in our country, right? Then what are the guidelines? Deserted wives and children are entitled to alimony maintenance from their husbands from the date they apply for it in the court of law. Now this is important because what happens even if they apply for it, for example, they apply for it today, there might be the case that they are getting it 5 years down the line, right? So how to sustain them? So there is a provision for interim maintenance, but that is too low for them to sustain a decent life. So now the court has said that they are entitled to alimony or maintenance from the date they apply. Then a violation would lead to punishment such as civil detention and even attachment of the property of the latter, that is the husband, if he does not pay the maintenance. Again, see, this is a common method used by the husbands not to give maintenance. They show that they don't have any property and they are out of jobs. So the court has said that the plea of a husband that he does not possess any source of income ipso facto does not absolve him of his moral duty to maintain his wife if he is able-bodied and has educational qualifications. So if he is able-bodied and educational qualifications, then he can't give the excuse that he does not possess any source of income. Now both the applicant wife and the respondent husband have to disclose their assets and liabilities in a maintenance case. Very important. Any earlier case filed or pending under any other law should also be revealed in the court. The expenses of the children, including their education, basic needs and other vocational activities, should be factored in by courts while calculating the alimony. Other factors such as spiraling inflation rates and high costs of living should also be considered, but the wife should receive the alimony which fit the standard of life she was used to in the matrimonial home, right? So this is what the court has said. Then to page 6 editorial, fixing the rules of the economy. The fundamentals of the game have changed as they currently favor wealthy investors and not workers and tiny enterprises. So this is by Mr. Arun Maira. He was member of the erstwhile Planning Commission. Now what he is telling us is that the solutions economists propose for fixing any economic crisis are free up the markets, improve productivity and apply technology. But these fundamentals of economies must be re-examined when applied to human work. That is the overall theme of this editorial. Now he is telling us how to rework them. He's making some interesting points. That is why we are discussing it, right? So let us get into it. So the solution economists propose are free up markets, improve productivity and apply technology. So now see, free up markets, the latest labor reforms and the agricultural reforms that we have made. So he's sort of taking a dig at it just in one statement, but otherwise he's making some good points. So about free markets, economists say markets should be freed up for agricultural product so that farmers can get higher price and freed up for labor to attract investment, right? So this is what we have done, right, recently through the reforms. Now the purpose of freeing up markets for labor is to reduce the burden of wage costs on investors just when wages and size of markets must be increased. So here he's saying that this has been done to basically facilitate the investor, not the workers, the labor and the agriculturists. That is what he's saying. He's saying that it should have been that the wages and the size of the market should have been increased at this point of time, and by these laws it has been restricted. Now see, he is making his point well and good, but then again you cannot increase wages out of the thin air, right? Now government of India does not have resources, it cannot create new jobs. Now new jobs have to come from the private sector. Now who would be willing to invest in India if we have very strict labor laws? For example, if we have a very high level for minimum wage, right? So who would want to invest here, right? So we have to make changes that are in line with the international model. Unfortunately, though we can make our own changes and we have introduced some form of social security in the labor code, but then again, we are also working in an international market, in an international globalized world. So we have to work accordingly, right? So it's a catch-22 situation. I'm not disagreeing with him. He's making a good point. But then again, we also have to look at realities. Very important point. Human rights must prevail over economic considerations. Humans are not commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. That is, he's actually taking a bid at the hire and fire system that is being introduced through backdoor. So this is about freeing up markets, right? Now, how to go about improving the productivity? So he says that improvement in productivity is the key to economic progress. Now, what is productivity to begin with? It is the ratio of output to input. That is, how much output you are getting for a unit of input that you're putting in, right? The higher the value, the higher the ratio, the higher the productivity. Yes. For any country or a system, that would tantamount to GDP upon population or output upon workers. That is how companies basically calculate their productivity, because population or workers, that is one of the biggest costs involved, right? So this is how you get a productivity for an economy or a system. Now companies can apply two broad strategies for improving their productivity. It is for companies, not countries. They can invest in capital, right, for machines and technologies, and here comes the role of technology. And number two, they can enhance their workers' skills, create a culture of continuous improvement in the factory, and more efficient use of the existing resources. Now here he is giving example of Japan, because Japan precisely did that. After World War II, their economy was in shatters, the country was in shatters, but by 70s, they had risen up to the level of an industrialized country. So very important because of the work culture in that country and the skill that they imbibed in the labor. So all that helped them to attain that status. So similarly, companies can do that, and countries should also be striving for doing that. Because see, if you invest in capital, it is a depreciating asset. You buy a machine and after some time its value would come down, right? And then there would be costs included in maintenance, overhaul and whatnot. So you can't really upgrade a machine. You can do that to a certain level. But human resource is one resource that you have which you can upgrade, right? So that is what he's saying, that humans are the only appreciating assets an enterprise has. How? Through skill development. They can improve their own abilities. Now, the lazy management strategy for improving productivity is to reduce the denominator, that is the number of workers. Productivity is equal to output upon workers. So they are not focusing on output, they are just reducing the number of workers, firing more and more people to artificially raise their productivity. Now that has led to the culture of hire and fire, that you hire people when times are good and when times are bad, you fire them. But a country is not a company. If it is not productive in terms of GDP per unit of population, its government does not have the luxury of firing citizens. Of course, where would the citizens go? The country cannot do that. For a capital scarce, human resource abundant countries, for example, India and all the developing countries, they have human resource because population is high, but they lack the capital because they don't have that much money to invest. Such as many developing countries, the correct ratio for productivity is output per unit of capital. See, this is an important concept, that rather than counting the number of people involved, we should count the money involved, because we don't have any scarcity of people, right? But we have the scarcity of capital or money. So we should focus on output per unit of capital invested. This was the strategy of Japan Inc. to make Japan an industrial powerhouse, and that is how they developed. So this is how it should be for a developing country. Productivity should be output upon unit capital invested. Now this was also the approach advocated by E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful. He has written some points that is in the article, you can read. Now he says that there was a malice brewing beneath the drive to westernize and technologize economies, and that is true because countries and economies, they were blindly copying the model of the West, right? Not paying attention to their own economies, to their own conditions, and that led to problems, including in India. Now he's also talking about a social contract that exists between workers and society. How workers provide the products and services that the society needs, right? So society should in return ensure that economy must create conditions whereby workers are treated with dignity and can earn adequate incomes. So that is the social contract that there should be between the worker and the society. Economist Danny Roderick, an authority on industrial policy and international trade, advocates reforms that will induce firms to employ more numbers of less skilled workers. Why? Because it will help the workers, number one, to earn a livelihood, right? And number two, once they are employed, they will be gaining skill. So it will also lead to skill development. Eventually, it will make the economy more productive. Why? Because such an economy, number one, would be focusing on capital, right? Per unit capital. Now you employ more numbers of less skilled workers. So you need to give less wages to them. Again, your capital costs are coming down, right? So this is what he's trying to say. He says a turbocharged financial globalization has made the life very easy for migrant capital while making the lives of migrant workers more precarious. Now, very important point. See, in this globalized world, what is happening? For example, China, which was till this point was acting as the factory of the world, right? So what was happening? That companies from developed countries, they were outsourcing their production, right? So they were basically outsourcing their capital, right? Migrant capital. That capital was being invested in China in terms of new factories, and that factories produced goods. Now it was good for China, right? That their production went, but it was very bad for the countries from where this money went out. So that is what it's trying to say, that in this world, it is very easy for money or migrant capital, but very, very tough for migrant workers because they find it very, very hard to find any meaningful work. He says that in this world, the rules do not favor workers and tiny enterprises because they have too little power. Their bargaining power is too little. That is why they are always at disadvantage. So then he talks about some solutions that are prophetic. So if you want, you can read them. But this is the important part from that editorial, right? Then this one, the financial capacity of states is being weakened. So this is by Mr. Krishna Bayer Gowda. So he is an ex-minister in the previous Karnataka government. So he's from the opposition parties, right? But the arguments that is giving are sound in the terms that they are based on facts, right? Hard facts. And he's giving sound arguments. There's no blind ideology or talking in the air. That is why we are discussing his article. Now let us see what he's saying. So the overall theme that he's talking about is that the center has systematically cut the share of states in taxes raised by the union government. Now these are known as devolutions, And basically what happens that the finance commission, it comes out with a divisible pool of taxes. Only taxes are shared, right? So under that, center devolves money to states. So he's saying that center has systematically cut the share of states in the taxes. Number two, it has reduced the pool of funds to be shared with states by shifting from taxes to cesses and surcharges. Now this is also very important because as per the recommendations of the Finance Commission, center is only supposed to share the collected taxes. See, number one, the recommendations of Finance Commission are not binding on the center. So at times center would be giving more than the recommendation, sometimes less than that, right? Number two, cesses and surcharges. Now these are additional taxes, right? Or you could say taxes on taxes. The main difference between cess and surcharge is that cess is imposed for a very particular purpose, right? For example, Swachh Bharat cess or any other cess, right? And it goes to the Consolidated Fund of India to a dedicated fund, right? And then that fund could be used only for that specific purpose, whereas surcharges are more generic. They can be imposed for any purpose and they can be used for any purpose, right? So this is cess and this is surcharge. Both are in common parlance are known as taxes on taxes, right? But there are some technicalities. Just to have an overall idea, just remember that they are imposed over and above the existing taxes. For example, there is GST cess that is above the highest category, 26% category, that is imposed for basically meeting the shortfalls in GST collection, right? So there are different purposes, but once you collect it under cess, then you can use it only for that particular purpose, right? And the third point he's making is that it is needlessly thrusting measly options to overcome the GST shortfall. For example, how the center said that the shortfall in GST this year is because of Act of God, and GST Act does not mandate center compensating the states for losses due to Act of God, and then it kind of forced borrowing options on the states, right? Now, first of all, he's talking about declining devolution. He says that prior to 2014, devolution of funds to the state were consistent and cumulatively more than 13th Finance Commission's projections. Like I said, sometimes they are more, sometimes they are less, because Finance Commission's recommendations or projections are not binding on the Government of India. And I've already told you, Finance Commission is formed under Article 280, right? Every 5 years by the President of India, right? We've also discussed the functions. Now, the year 2014-15 commenced with a shock. Actual devolution was 14% less than the Finance Commission's projections. And to the year 2019-20, it has come down to a whopping difference of 37% less than what the devolution was suggested by Finance Commission. Now, second, he's talking about the shrinking in divisible pool, that center is actually taking a back route. It is going for more surcharges and cesses rather than taxes. Now, again, when surcharges and cesses are collected, then center does not have to share that with the states. So various cesses and surcharges are levied by the union government and are retained fully by it. They do not go into the divisible pool. This allows center to raise revenues yet not share them with the states. Hence, the union government imposes or increases cesses and surcharges instead of taxes wherever possible, and in some cases even replaces taxes and cesses and surcharges. Now what happens that the consumer, you and I, at the end of the day, we end up paying the same amount, but that money is now exclusively going to the center because it is going under cess and surcharge and not as tax. So when taxes are replaced with cesses and surcharges, as has been done repeatedly by this government, in the case of petrol and diesel, the consumer pays the same price. But the union government keeps more of that revenue and reduces the size of the divisible pool. As a result, states lose out on their share. Now he's saying that between 2014-15 and 19-20, cesses and surcharges soared from 9.3% to 15% of the gross tax revenue of union government. So again, there is a tendency of moving towards cesses and surcharges, and he's not talking in thin air, he's giving hard facts, right? Now talking of GST shortfall. Shortfalls have been persistent and growing from the inception of GST. Compensations have been paid from the GST cess revenue, right? GST cesses are levied on luxury or sin goods on top of GST, that is 26% category, right? So again, tax on tax, right? And this is a cess. So this will go to the Consolidated Fund of India for a particular purpose, that is only for compensation of GST. That money cannot be used for any other purpose. Now, there was a controversy about this as well in the past, but let's not get into it. Such cesses have justification independent of the compensation needs. These are and will be levied irrespective of compensation needs, and GST compensation will end with 2021-22. But now many quarters of the government are saying that they will continue it for another 5 years, right? So this is not completely true, or this is not completely valid as of now. But cesses will continue, of course. During 2019-20, the cess collected was 95,444 crores. So such a high amount. With the abnormal exception of this year, the years ahead will generate similar or more cess revenue. This assured cess revenue, he's saying, within the GST can meet any contingency needs, even an act of God, the excuse that government was giving, without burdening the center or the state governments. The union government should borrow this year's GST. Again, government has done that shortfall in full and release it to the states. But center is not borrowing in full, right? Out of 3 lakh crore, it is only borrowing for 1.8 lakh crore. The union government will not have to pay a rupee of this debt or interest. The entire loan can be repaid out of the assured cess revenue that will continue to accrue beyond 2022. Valid points. Of the nearly 3 lakh crore GST shortfall to the states, the center will only compensate rupees 1.8 lakh crore. So there is a shortfall. The states will not get the remaining 1.2 lakh crore this year, and that is the problem. This cut is being imposed for no reason, and he's absolutely right in saying that. Flies right in the face of economic reasoning, because at the time when the economy is not doing well, states should get more money, right? Because states are at the forefront, they are at the cutting edge. So if states have more money, they'll be dispersing more money to the people, more activities in the state, and that will revive the economy. But center is doing just the opposite, right? So that is why he's saying that it flies right in the face of economic reasoning. And now the third point he's making is central grants are also likely to drop significantly this year. Now for this, he has not provided any figures. So that is what he's saying. Now coming to the conclusion, he's saying again, due to the combined effect of the 3 facts that we just saw, cutback in devolution, shrinking divisible pool, and failure to pay full GST compensation this year, and fall in central grants, the states may experience a fall of 20 to 25% of their revenue this year. So this is a very huge fall, right? He says that states are at the forefront of development and generation of opportunities and growth. So strong states lead to strong India. The systematic weakening of states serve neither federalism nor national interest. So very, very good. This is important for your paper 2, center state relations, economic relations, and also for your GS paper 3 economy, right? How center should go about it. Very, very good article. Then this one, authoritarian turn. So what is happening in US, everybody is seeing, right? So the world's oldest democracy was overshadowed by Mr. Trump himself, who took a distinctly authoritarian turn when he claimed falsely that he had already defeated Mr. Biden, right? I told you when we were discussing the front page that he has self-proclaimed victory, and he's a very smart guy, right? He's dumb in general parlance, but when it comes to business deals or making his own case, he's a very, very smart guy. Throughout these months, he's been making a case that these postal ballots, they are bogus, right? Now what will happen? The moment he loses, he will go to the Supreme Court and he'll say that these postal ballots were bogus. I've been telling you. And he's also put conservative judges on the Supreme Court bench. If you remember, I told you 6:3. There are 6 conservative judges and 3 liberal ones. So if the case goes to the Supreme Court, there is a likelihood that he will win, right? And even before this, he went to the Supreme Court to get this whole postal ballot system invalidated, but that did not happen. And then again, he said that these postal votes should not be counted. So this is an attempt to disenfranchise a large section of the population, right? So he's a very smart guy when it comes to his own interests, right? Particularly that he had won the Rust Belt states, which in reality are still counting millions of votes. He went on to complain that 2020 election was being stolen from him through a major fraud, reiterating his vow to take the matter expediently to the Supreme Court. Now both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump are saying that they will go to the court and none of them is going to concede. See, earlier what used to happen, that within a day or two, trends would be clear, right? And because of that, one candidate would concede defeat, right? but that is not happening now. Another important fact to understand is that this time around, the voter turnout was very, very high. Earlier elections, the politicians in the US, they have been crying that people do not come out and vote. But this time the voter turnout has been very, very high, and the margins are too narrow between Mr. Trump and Biden. Again, Mr. Trump has proven the poll pundits sort of wrong, because they were predicting a landslide victory for Mr. Biden, which is not happening, right? Many of the postal ballots are still to be counted. Many states have different rules for postal ballots. For example, some states have given up till 9th of November for the reception of postal ballot, provided that they should have been posted by the last date of voting, right? So there are different rules. Many votes are to be counted, and no clear trend is emerging as of now, right? Now there are three broad observations regarding this turn of events. First, it is unclear why Mr. Trump would attack the vote tallying process in the swing states, given that he's leading some of them anyway. Now see, there are two kinds of states in the US politics. One are the ones that are totally or surely either Democratic or Republic. Then there are some states which are swing states. So now in some swing states he's leading, but then again he is questioning the tallying process. Second, his statement is tantamount to a demand that legally cast ballots should not be recorded, which if true implies an unprecedented attempt at mass voter suppression, like I told you. Third, Mr. Trump appears intent upon escalating the matter to the Supreme Court. Now he is being unfair to Mr. Trump here. I'm not Trump supporter, but Mr. Biden has also promised the same thing, that he will go to the Supreme Court if he loses. Perhaps a strategy based on the idea of getting the conservative majority to the court, including his recent nominee Amy Coney Barrett, to rule in his favor. So let us see now how this drama unfolds. Then this one is about star status. We've already discussed what is star status, right? First of all, there is no definition, neither in the Representation of People's Act, neither by the Election Commission of India, no definition of as to who is the star status. But what is the advantage of star status? Such campaigners, their campaigning expenditures are not counted among the expenditure of the candidate, right? So that enables some star candidates to use helicopters and reach distant destinations without actually incurring costs in the accounts of the candidate. So it is sort of a back route, right? And if you remember, section 77B of the Representation of People's Act, that gives the leverage for star candidates. Again, who is to decide who is a star candidate? Only the party, right? So the Election Commission, it removed the star status of Mr. Kamal Nath because of his statements. Then the Chief Justice said that the Election Commission does not have the authority to do so, right? Because section 77(1) of the Representation of People's Act says it is the political party which chooses, which removes star candidates. So this is what this editorial is saying. Now they are also making a case that Election Commission of India should have this power in case the Model Code of Conduct is breached. Now what is Model Code of Conduct? This is not a law, it is just some guideline which is given by Election Commission of India, and majorly all political parties follow it, how to conduct yourself during an election, right? So after all, star status ensures some leaders can charter helicopters, travel extensively. The ECI has cited the clause in the MCC that bars candidates from resorting to criticism of all aspects of private life not connected with public activity. So this is again under the Model Code of Conduct, that while campaigning you should not be personal. Even though the Model Code is not statutory, it has been generally recognized that election watchdog should have some means of enforcing its norms. In past orders, the ECI has cited the Supreme Court's observations that when laws are absent, the ECI can invoke residuary power to meet an infinite variety of situations that cannot be foreseen by lawmakers. So see, this is a gray area. That is why there is a chance of misuse of this moral code of conduct and other things. Then page 9, China remains quiet on Pak's Gilgit-Baltistan move. So all this article is saying is that China reacted very sharply when India announced revocation of Article 370, and it split J&K into two union territories, Ladakh and J&K, right? At that time, China said that this violates China's sovereignty because the Ladakh UT includes Aksai Chin and China claims Aksai Chin as its own, right? But now this time around, when Pakistan has done so, it is not commenting. Why? Because it is in China's favors, CPEC, if you remember, we've been discussing 2-3 times, right? I've told you why China would want Pakistan to integrate Gilgit-Baltistan. So this is what this article is saying. You can read this. Then government forms panel to review the TRP norm. So there was a TRP controversy. We've discussed that. So the Information and Broadcasting Ministry has constituted a 4-member committee to review the guidelines on television rating agencies. The existing guidelines were issued after detailed deliberations by parliamentary committee and on recommendations of the TRAI. The guidelines have been in operation for the past few years. Now time to review. It said a need has been felt to have a fresh look keeping in view the recent recommendations of TRAI, technological advancements, and for further strengthening of the procedures for a credible and transparent rating system. We've all discussed it, right? If you manipulate TRP, then you also manipulate the revenues. This market is very, very huge, around 80,000 crore, right? Now, existing system, the committee will carry out an appraisal of the existing system, examine TRAI recommendations notified from time to time, overall industry scenario, and address the needs of stakeholders. So again, a 4-member committee that will be reviewing these TRP norms. Then Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, not for hydropower project in Himachal Pradesh. So approved the funding for this project, Luhuri hydropower project on Satluj River in Himachal Pradesh. So this is all that you need to know from this. Now Center launches initiative to improve quality of life. So it has been launched by the Union Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry. The challenge is called Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge, and it is for cities to develop and implement initiatives to improve the quality of life of young children, caregivers and families. This will be open for the 100 smart cities, cities with population of more than 5 lakhs and state union territory capitals. Then page 10, US election, all about that. Interesting here, Twitter flags Trump tweet accusing Democrats of stealing election. So his tweet was flagged by Twitter and similar action was also taken by Facebook. Now page 13, just the headline, India enjoys bipartisan support, says our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Harsh Shringla. Then US formally exits Paris Pact on curbing climate change. So the United States formally left the Paris Agreement, a global pact forged 5 years ago to avert the threat of catastrophic climate change. So this was signed by Obama, right? But Trump got out of it because he does not believe in the science of climate change. He says that it is China's agenda. Some 189 countries remain committed to 2015 Paris Accord, which aims to keep the increase in average temperatures worldwide well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. But this is not happening, unfortunately. A further 6 countries have signed but not ratified the pact. Scientists say that any rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius could have a devastating impact on large parts of the world, raising sea levels, stoking tropical storms and worsening droughts and floods. And we are seeing all of these things, more and more tropical storms and typhoons, even in India. Then the erratic nature of monsoon, then droughts are also increasing and floods are also increasing. We are all witnessing these changes right in front of our eyes, yet we are not doing anything. The Paris Accord requires countries to set their own voluntary targets for reduction of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. These are called INDC, intended nationally determined commitments of different countries. The US is world's second biggest emitter. India is third. And if you remember, we discussed how India's emissions are half of the US emission despite being the third, right? And in terms of per capita emissions, we are much lesser than US and China. So US is the world's second biggest emitter after China of heat trapping gases such as carbon dioxide, and its contribution to cutting emissions is seen as important, but it is not alone in the effort, right? Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has said he favors signing the US back up to Paris Accord because the Democrats favor it, Obama, right? Then just the headline, GDP will be higher than forecast this year. This is what the finance ministry is saying. Then October service sector PMI signals first expansion since February. So if you remember, there was also a PMI for service sector which surveyed 300 factories, right, or companies. So this is telling us about that. Again, if you remember yesterday we discussed score of 50, that means stable or no growth or no contraction, below 50 contraction, above 50 growth. So it has now come to 54.1 from 49.8. If you remember last month we discussed that it has come very close to the 50 figure and now it has crossed it. So Indian service sector activities ended the 7-month sequence of decline and registered growth in October, supported by improved market conditions amid easing of COVID-19 restrictions. But again, the peculiar thing is that unemployment even in service sector is rising. A print above 50 means expansion and a score below that denotes contraction as per IHS Markit India Services Purchaser Managers Index. New work intakes. Service companies reported an increase in new work intakes, which they attributed to successful marketing efforts and strengthening demand. But on the job front, there was another monthly decline in employment. The pace of job shedding was solid and matched that recorded in September. Survey participants indicated that workers on leave had not returned and that a widespread fear of COVID-19 contamination continued to restrict staff supply. So this is about service sector. Again, it has come above the 50 territory. Now starting with the Indian Express front page, just the headline, America counts on. Then to page number 6, Kerala revokes general consent for CBI probes. So after Maharashtra, if you remember last month we discussed, Maharashtra has also revoked CBI the permission, the general consent. Now Kerala has also done so. So the general consent had been given to CBI as per notification under section 6 of Delhi Special Police Establishment Act 1946. Kerala has become the 5th state to withdraw general consent after Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal and Chhattisgarh. All 5 are non-BJP states. Now why? Over which case? This gold smuggling case, and that was spilling into another case. So that is why they have revoked this general consent. Now at this point, let us understand what sort of cases can CBI really look into at the state level. Now first of all, why do states need to give CBI the permission? See, law and order is a state subject. So CBI needs to have permission from the states before conducting any inquiry within the state regarding cases of law and order, right? Now this general consent means that CBI does not need any permission from the state government, and once the center gives it a go ahead, it can go and conduct its inquiries for any case, right? So that is what general consent means, but now it has been revoked. So now for registering any case in the state which has revoked this general consent, CBI would have to take its permission. So let us see what sort of cases CBI really looks into at the state level. So what type of cases is the CBI involved at the state level? So at the state level, CBI looks into 3 cases: Anti-Corruption Division, Economic Offences Division and Special Crimes Division. These are the 3 divisions within CBI, and at state level also they look into that, right? So what is Anti-Corruption Division? It investigates cases against public servants which are under the control of central government or are working in public sector undertakings, or against public servants working under state governments which have been entrusted to the CBI by state. So in this case, if there is a public servant which is under state government has to refer that case to the CBI, and serious departmental irregularities committed by the above mentioned. So this is for the Anti-Corruption Division. Then comes the Economic Offences Division, which investigates financial crimes, bank frauds, money laundering, illegal money market operation, grafts in PSUs and banks. So this is the second unit. Then the third Special Crimes Division handles cases of conventional natures such as offences relating to internal security, espionage, sabotage, narcotics and psychotropic substances, antiquities, murders, dacoities, robberies, cheating, among others. So these are the cases that come under the Special Crimes Division, right? Now what is the general consent? Again, general consent is given to CBI as per notification under section 6 of Delhi Special Police Establishment Act 1946, and this is the act which empowers CBI or has given rise to CBI. Now CBI was formed under the British era and it was basically made to spy upon Indian nationalists, right? Now after that its role has changed. Now 5 states have removed general consent. We've already discussed West Bengal, Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra and Kerala. Now the decision means that the central agency will have to get consent from the state government for every case it registers in such a state. So this is about general consent. Now CBI has been in news for the wrong and right reasons, whatever you might have your opinion about it. So it is important that you know these things. Then again on page 6, support data localization, Geo platform tells House panel. So we have been discussing about the data protection bill from the Indian Express. We have discussed many articles. Last one we discussed was when Google told this panel, this joint committee, that India should not go for data localization, and that really riled some of the committee members, right? So now Geo made its deposition before the panel and it said that it supports data localization. I've already told you what is data localization. It means that the data that is generated in India, it should be saved in servers located within India. And why is it important? Because such servers would come under the jurisdiction of Government of India. Now this data is owned by Indians, so ultimately Indians should have the right over its use, right? Now when such data is stored in foreign locations like the US or China, then it is governed by those countries' laws. For example, when you store data on any Chinese app, so there's a 2017 Chinese law which mandates any Chinese company to basically share any sort of data that the Communist Party or the government there asks in the name of national security. So it cannot say no, right? So your data is highly compromised. And we also saw how the Chinese companies sponsored by the Chinese state are running sophisticated spy operations, right? They're building sophisticated profiles of many people, including the President of India. We've seen that, right? So that is why data protection and data localization is very, very important. Now, Geo said that it supports this data localization and it would naturally support that because it is an Indian country. Now, the problem lies with the foreign companies like Facebook or Amazon or Google because they transfer data to foreign servers. Then they also sell our data without telling us, right? And they earn a revenue from it. So a joint parliamentary committee on personal data protection bill on Wednesday heard the views of Reliance Industries Digital Business Unit. It is learned that the representatives of Jio Platform Limited and Reliance Jio Infocomm told the panel that the company supports localization of data. The executives told the panel that the companies do not share data with third parties like Facebook. In April, Facebook had purchased nearly 10% stake in Jio Platforms. Deposing before the panel, tech giant Google had argued that India should avoid data localization requirements. The representatives of e-commerce giant Amazon too had expressed reservations over localization of data and cross-border restrictions on flow of data. I've told you why. Now it is learned that Reliance representatives were asked whether there is any data sharing mechanism between the company and its investors, Facebook and Google, and its users. The representatives replied in the negative and argued that both tech firms are its financial investors. So this is going to get big and this is very important for you and me. We don't realize the importance of data protection, but it is very, very important. Then again, very important news. Department of Military Affairs moots raising retirement age, cut in pension in forces. This was also in the Hindu, but it was a very small news there. So I'm discussing here. So proposal to increase retirement age across all ranks below the Lieutenant Governor level in armed forces is in advanced stages and could get government sanction soon. Now, it has also told us the advantages and disadvantages, more so the concerns within the defense establishment regarding this move, right? Now, this Department of Military Affairs is headed by General Rawat, who is the Chief of Defense Staff, right? Now, in the new proposal, retirement age of officers across services at colonel rank will be increased from the present 54 years to 57 years, so 3 years of more service. Brigadier level officers, it will be raised to 58 from 56, and Major General level officers will be 59 from 58. Lieutenant General level officers retire at the age of 60, and no changes suggested in that. Service chiefs retire at the age of 62 or after serving 3 years in office, whichever is earlier. Now, the age for retirement of junior commissioned officers or JCOs and their equivalent ranks in Navy and Air Force across all streams will be 57 years, it is suggested. There is another proposal under consideration is that the revision of pension entitlements. At present, officers who have completed 20 years of service and the personnel below officer rank with 15 years of service get 50% of their last drawn emoluments as entitled pension. But now this is going to be reduced as per the proposal. It has not been accepted as of yet. The DMA letter has proposed that pension entitlements for premature retirement of personnel should be half of the entitled pension after 20 to 25 years of service, 60% of entitled pension after 26 to 30 years, And it is proposed that personnel who have done 31 to 35 years of service should get 75% of entitled pension, and those who have completed 35 years or more in service will get full pension. The pension scheme has been reviewed for these reasons. Now it mentions there will be no change in pension entitlements of battle casualties. Now the concerns, what are the concerns? That a sudden move like this is likely to be challenged in court as it can impact a large number of serving personnel, especially those close to retirement. A concern among some officers is that the move can freeze promotion boards for 2 to 3 years. Now this would be very bad for these officers, right? As the retirement age of senior officers will be extended and no vacancies would be created. On the proposal to cut pension, one view is that since other organizations give full pensions, it can cause loss of morale among personnel. So the concerns are it could be challenged in court, then it could delay promotions for the next 2-3 years for the next level or the next generation of officers, and other services give full pension. So why cut pensions in the armed forces? It could lead to a loss of morale among personnel. So let us see if government accepts this. Then again, government forms panel to look into TRP system. We've already discussed this. India tests enhanced Pinaka system. An enhanced version of Pinaka Mk1 missile developed by DRDO was successfully flight tested from the integrated test range in Chandipur of Odisha coast. The enhanced version was taken up to achieve longer range performance compared to the earlier design with lesser length. Now this is a very, very important news and very interesting as well. This is about AI, right? So where is the chemistry? Two AI powered bots are trying to strike up a romance. The future is here and it is disturbing. So Cookie is a AI bot of Facebook and the other is Blender bot, and they have been on their longest first date since October 24. They have been chatting 24/7, right? So this Cookie, he looks like a muscly version of Mark Zuckerberg, sports a cap which says make Facebook great again, and he likes Hitler and has killed people. Cookie's date is Blenderbot, an AI powered chatbot built by Facebook, as is Cookie, the creation of an individual out of UK. Their tryst is part of a competition to see which bot can pass off more easily as a human. The experiment contest is meant to see if bots can stimulate the most humane of interactions, a romantic encounter, but as with many a real date, it has been boring, horrifying. Blenderbot, after casually admitting to murder, asked if Cookie has killed people too, and seemingly interminable. Given that the ever greater number of people have been turning to AI powered online companions in recent years, the prospect of a digital being harboring a love for Hitler while having the same hobbies you do opens up a can of worms about the nature of love and human society in the tech age that challenges the limit of science fiction, let alone ethics. Now, this is very important and this is a very pertinent question for our future. For example, in Japan, you would find many young men, they are actually hooked to their devices. Those devices are basically dating companions, right? So, and that has had a very great impact on the Japanese society because young men are no longer seeking out women. So this could have a very great impact on our society. And more people are getting lonely these days. People are building walls around themselves. They're more into cyberspace than meeting people in real lives. So this is taking a toll on human interactions and human relationships. Maybe the machines have already taken over and no one really got wind of it. So there are some examples of AI that are actually working. The bot Vera works in HR and can interview as many as 1500 candidates per day, including for IKEA. IBM's bot assistant Watson works for some of the largest companies in the world, and producers of pornographic content. If you remember, we discussed about deepfakes, right? That is also use of AI, and most important application, unfortunately, is in the porn industry only. Have long been moving into more interactive AI and robotic products. On the flip side, human beings are becoming more and more cyborg-like, outsourcing memory, reason, and even emotion to machine. And if Cookie's terrible date is anything to go by, the machines can be pretty horrible people too. So see, this is a question on the future of humanity. Then page 11 explained. So just these 2 points that there have been disputes earlier. So in 1876, Congress set up a bipartisan federal electoral commission comprising of House representatives, senators, and Supreme Court justices. Now see, this was a commission. Here the Supreme Court did not directly intervene, but in 2000 case it did, right? 20 electoral college votes were disputed and the commission gave all to Hayes, who won the election by the thinnest possible margin, 185 to 184, and became the 19th president. Then in 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore, the Supreme Court halted the vote recount in Florida, which effectively allowed George W. Bush to win the election and become the 43rd president. Now it is said in America that no one has become a president yet without winning Florida. Now Trump, I think, won Florida, but it seems that he's going to lose this one. But again, I'm telling you, no matter who loses or who wins, this is going to the Supreme Court nonetheless. So what happens if Supreme Court is involved to settle the electoral dispute about delayed votes or postal ballots, as Trump has threatened? In 57 presidential elections, the Supreme Court has been directly involved in only the 2000 contest between George W. Bush and Al Gore that we have discussed, right? Now, with the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court has a clear majority of conservative judges. Until the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there were 4 liberal justices and 4 conservative justices, with Chief Justice John Roberts, a moderately conservative justice who agreed with the liberal bloc of justices in certain decisions. So total 9 judges, 1 Chief Justice and 8 other. Now 6:3 majority, right? Because Chief Justice is moderately conservative, right? And other 5 are for sure conservative, right? While this does not necessarily imply that the court will take sides, Trump's claims of electoral fraud may indeed receive a sympathetic hearing, and he has been building up his case for quite some time, so he will get a hearing. Again, important news, especially for India, Saudis to remove key restrictions on migrant laborers. So first of all, the laborers that go to Saudi, they go under a kafala sponsorship system, right? And that is followed in many Gulf Arab countries. What happens that you are invited by an employer, then whether you can change your job or you can leave that country, it is dependent on the consent of your employer. Now that opens a space for exploitation, right? And there have been many cases where people have been forced into virtually forced labor and whatnot, right? We have all heard of the stories of cruelty against laborers, especially in these Gulf countries, right? But there are many people, poor people from our country who go to work in these countries, right? And then they send important remittance. So that is an important thing for our forex reserves as well. And many people go there. So this legislation, this piece of legislation is important. Now see what the Saudis are doing. And if you look at it, Saudis have been looking for reforming their country. They're trying to open up. They're trying to go from oil dependence to the post-oil dollar economy. And they're also making changes in the social realm. So this is among one of those changes. So the reforms will allow foreign workers the right to change jobs, leave and re-enter the country, and secure final exit visas without consent of employers. Now, the so-called Labor Relation Initiative is slated to come into effect in 2021, affecting potentially around a third of Saudi's total population of, or approximately 10 million foreign workers in the kingdom. Saudi authorities are removing some elements of the kafala sponsorship system in place across multiple Gulf Arab states that ties foreign workers' legal status to their employer. Qatar, which is preparing to host the next FIFA World Cup in 2022, has recently introduced similar changes to its labor laws. These significant steps that could improve migrant workers' conditions, but caution it that it does not appear to be a full abolition of the kafala system. Migrant workers still need an employer to sponsor them to come to the country, and employers may still have control over their residency status. Under Saudi's restrictive kafala system, workers had little power to escape abuse because their employers controlled their exit from the country and their ability to change jobs. Many employers exploited this control by taking workers' passports, forcing them to work excessive hours and denying them wages. This has led to hundreds of thousands of workers fleeing their employers and becoming undocumented. So this is the stark reality. That is why East or West, your own country, that is India, is the best, right? So folks, that is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos, and please give us a thumbs up if you liked our videos. Also connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. And please connect with us on our Telegram page where you can access the PDFs of the videos that I'll be posting daily, right? So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.